So Patrick, we no longer have a Type 3 survey. What do we have to do?
That's right, Mel. The new survey guide has in effect abolished the Type 1, Type 2, Type 3 survey as you and I knew it from MDHS 100. The new document is a guidance document and refers to two types of survey only, the management survey and the pre-refurbishment demolition survey. Now essentially the management survey is the Type 2 as was and is now very much aimed at duty holders complying with regulation for the duty to manage asbestos in non-domestic premises. The Type 3 survey has in effect been superseded by the pre-refurbishment demolition survey. Now the Type 3 survey used to be described as a pre-major refurbishment or demolition survey. The word major has now been removed and so it covers much more minor works. So yes, we're now left with two types of survey, management and pre-refurbishment stroke demolition.
So no more Type 2, Type 3 asbestos surveys?
That's right. Essentially the Type 2 and Type 3 regime has been superseded. So for Carillion contractually obviously there is a difference between Type 2 and Type 3 asbestos, and that's now been superseded by the terms management survey and pre-refurbishment demolition survey.
The new asbestos guidance is going to have a huge impact on the client and Carillion. Is this true?
It could potentially have an impact. In terms of the magnitude of that impact, I would say it's very much dependent on the building type. I think it's going to have benefits because the costs associated with asbestos are principally met at the far end of the project in terms of the removal contractor being on site and additional asbestos being found. So a relatively small additional outlay in getting a more in-depth survey carried out on the building to quantify and measure the extent of the asbestos better in advance of the removal contractor coming on will actually lead to overall project savings, and obviously delays to the project, etc. will be mitigated.
So Patrick, are there any implications with regard to time for Carillion and the client?
Potentially, the survey guide brings with it both an upside and a downside. On the upside, there is better knowledge of asbestos, which in terms of the overall removal or abatement project that follows the survey, during refurbishment or demolition of buildings, time can be saved because more is known about the extent of the asbestos, so unknowns aren't revealed. In terms of actually carrying out the survey though, Mel, you're right, there is potentially something of an add-on to the time. For example, if asbestos is found in a location and the surveyor suspects that there may be another material behind that asbestos, they have to get through the asbestos. What the guidance says is that any work with this would be work with asbestos that should be carried out by a licensed contractor, and so this would fall under the HSE's 14-day notification regime, which would clearly add something of a delay. But then the information that is known from this investigation can go to make time savings in the overall project.
So what about the part within the guidance that states where there is a pre-refurb and pre-demolition survey that the building has not got to be occupied during the time of the survey?
That's right, it does talk about occupation. I think historically there have been organisations that have carried out surveys in areas that have been occupied, and that's clearly unacceptable. Any pre-refurbishment or demolition survey should really mimic on a small and controlled scale the activities that are due to follow. So for instance, if a wall is to come out, that wall should really be penetrated. And what the guidance says is that we mustn't do surveys in areas that are directly occupied. And if there are furnishings and fixtures and fittings in the room, they should really be sheeted out with polythene to protect them. And more importantly, once the survey is completed, the area should be assessed for reoccupation by people if it is to be reoccupied. And one way to do this might be reassurance air monitoring. And obviously at Lucian we've got an in-house analytical capability, so we can dispatch an analyst to site to make sure this happens for you.
If we are doing some minor work, will it be okay not to bring you in?
You may be okay without calling us in, and it's really a matter of assessing the task against the information that is to hand. For example, if cabling work is to be done and the asbestos is known, the extent of the asbestos rather is known within the ceiling void, and the works aren't going to impinge on it, yes, the management survey may be fine in that case. However, if a door frame is to be removed, and if we work that scenario through, the architrave hasn't been investigated behind, the door frame hasn't been investigated behind, and the centre sandwich of the door hasn't been inspected during the management survey, pre-refurbishment survey would have to be undertaken. Because if we picture a scenario of the door needing to be shortened after its replacement, and there's an asbestos sandwich within that door, and a joiner comes along with an electric plane, there could be an untold level of exposure incurred.
Once again, Patrick, what else does the guidance require us to do?
There are a couple of interesting points that the guidance brings to the table. One of them is that the client must assess the competence of the organisation carrying out the work. This is very much in line, obviously, with the CDM regulations, making sure that competent professionals are engaged. And one way to do it is to ensure that the organisation is UCAS accredited, or that the individual surveyors are accredited. Lucian's a fully UCAS accredited organisation, both for testing, which is mandatory, and for asbestos inspection, which is voluntary. Levels of professional indemnity cover should also be considered, and the experience of the individual surveyors doing those specific types of property should be demonstrable. Another aspect that it brings is the client not commissioning asbestos surveys totally in isolation, i.e. sitting down with the surveyor and ensuring that the surveyor understands the extent of the client's works to focus the investigation towards that, to generate meaningful information, which of course will in turn prevent people being inadvertently exposed to asbestos.
Patrick, when Lucian is going to undertake a survey for us, what other information will Carillion have to supply to you?
Well, that relates to the previous point. Yes, we will need a certain amount of information from you, just as you will need information from us. The types of information we need from you are constructional information about the building, any previous surveys that have been undertaken, the scope of the works that you are due to undertake. And whilst MDHS 100 called for this information in terms of a desktop study, the new guidance explicitly calls for a checklist of information. Likewise, the surveyor should sit down with the client and clarify any areas of non-access, any areas that may have health and safety restrictions or implications, the listed status of any buildings so as not to cause damage to them, and of course talk through any caveats that may appear in the report. And the guidance quite explicitly says that caveats must be agreed up front of the work being carried out.